Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. I'm here with Kevin Kennon. He is a guest speaking about the future of urbanization based in New York City, so the heart of urban life. Kevin, welcome so much to Future of XYZ.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much for inviting me on your fantastic podcast, and it's an honor to be here.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate that you're here. You are a many times over award-winning architect with projects featured in the permanent collection at MoMA, also in New York City, the Museum of Modern Art. And you run a firm called Beyond Zero, DDC, based in New York City, but doing projects all over the world, it seems. And you've really kind of pivoted, even with that name, deeply into sustainability and sustainable visionary status, I think. And I think that's an interesting place for us to kind of explore in the future of urbanization. But before I get into all my cool and exciting questions that I'm dying to ask you, we always have to start out by asking our guests, in the context of your experience and expertise, Kevin, how do we define this topic of urbanization?
Let's start by uh, taking on the word sustainability. Um, yeah, I was an English major before I became an architect. And so words matter a great deal. And I think it's something, because we're such a visual oriented profession, that we sometimes get tripped up in words. Um, and and so before we talk about urbanization, I think it's important that we talk about sustainability, because unfortunately I have come to believe that it's overused, and it sort of uh, it's become a term that is loses sight of one of our strengths in architecture, or historically one of our strengths, which is to lead the way towards a future. Because sustainability is essentially about staying in place, sustaining, and you have to ask ourselves, what exactly are we sustaining? Because let's face it, the present sucks. And I like to look at where we're going, and in particular, how we can reimagine the future. So I'm not really quite sure exactly what the term is that we should be using, but let's just start with regenerative as opposed to sustaining in place. So how do we create a regenerative city? And I think that's a very interesting place to start. And I think the question really is, you know, historically, why do people want to gather in a city? What is it about cities that attract people to in the first place? And I think key to that is an understanding that the city offers a diversity of experience. If you live, away from the city, and you have you want to learn about someplace other else in the world, or you have a particular kind of focus, generally you can find these things by traveling to the city. Today, we do a lot of that just by the internet. We kind of connect ourselves globally. So if the traditional way was the reason people got together was because they wanted a diversity of experience, what is it about the city now that can keep people there and keep people continuing to there? Because every statistics I've seen is that we're increasingly becoming living in urban areas, or at least urban sprawls.
Well, I mean, I actually have that last year, 58% of the world's 8.2 billion people were living in cities
Yeah.
or in urban areas. And the
Right.
trend is expected to continue to rise, with projections suggesting 70% by 2050 and almost 80% by 2100, which seems like the case for the future of urbanization is actually the future of man or
Yeah.
human.
Yes, exactly. I think the future of all of us and humanity itself. And so you can't, and this is the key, I think, to reimagining what that city is, because unfortunately, most of our models of the future of the city tend to be a little dystopian. And I think, my profession, our profession, has devolved into problem solvers, and I think we need to get back to our fundamental role in society, which is to lead towards a better future. And if that's a little utopian, I'm guilty as charged.
Well, what are I mean, you work all over the world. I mean, I'm curious about what this future, I think we've defined urbanization basically as like the process of a population living increasingly in urban areas. And in that, obviously, there are opportunities and challenges for architects and city/urban planners for sure. But in your experience working in big cities, from obviously New York, but also, I don't know, Tokyo, London, Sao Paulo, whatever big city, Istanbul, whatever big city we want to name, like what are some of these challenges and opportunities that you've seen that face architects that are unique in these urban areas?
Well, let's just take one that I know pretty well, having spent a lot of time there, Beijing. Um, when I first traveled to Beijing, it must have been in the mid 90s. And Beijing was a terrible place. It was designed sort of Soviet era kind of planning with these giant super blocks. There's a mass of people, but the pollution was unbelievable. I mean, you could not walk on most days, you couldn't walk out of your hotel room without feeling like you were choking to death. Um, and China embarked on a very, um, I'd say, progressive and rapid decarbonization, which essentially reduced the pollution levels to today, which is far, far better than what it used to be. Now, they just did a study I read last week where that one of the reasons they now think that they, meaning experts in climate change, they now think one of the contributors to the increase of global warming, which we now, I think the evidence is clear that last year we went above the 1.5 degree
Threshold for
yeah.
sustainable life that was set by the UN as a target goal, right?
Thank you. Yes, that's good. um, uh, and that China contributed something like 80% of that, because it so rapidly decelerated fossil fuel, and the carbon that it emitted in the atmosphere, contradictorily had a cooling effect on the Earth's temperature. So even so,
I heard something yesterday that China is actually now running at 70% renewables, which is like I mean, that's pretty amazing when we're moving in the opposite direction.
yes, well, that in and of itself is a whole nother
We
issue.
being Americans, because
Yeah,
we have audience everywhere.
right. Well, and so the urgency, obviously, of trying to get a handle on what that becomes, because if it simply becomes a question of rapid population growth that isn't and that we don't use the tools that we have at hand in order to create a more humane city, then it's really going to devolve into something not completely dystopian.
Well, it's
So
interesting because you talked about how Beijing as an example, but historically, ever since really we're talking, I mean, way back, but starting in the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution, I mean, cities have been dirty, polluted, and polluters, not necessarily these epicenters of health and wellness. And of course, that's increasingly what people are seeking in what you were asking, like, why do people come to cities? It's for diversity of experience, but now increasingly there's nature that's desired, and there's culture, and there's all these things that are about health and wellness. So I'm curious, like, to make cities, as we urbanize further and further in the future, like to make them habitable for both human and non-human inhabitants, and maybe even positive contributors to the surrounding nature or in environment. What is their role of architects? And I'm going to add in urban planners and policymakers and things in being more eco-friendly and combating climate change, and maybe even, I don't know, as you just said, like reducing carbon emissions and being a positive contributor.
Well, I think part of it is, and this is kind of what I would say the focus of my career at this point is recalibrating how we conceptualize nature. And I think that so much of at least the 21st century, there's a sort of false dichotomy between cities, urbanism, and nature, and they were considered to be opposite, right? You lived in the rural area, that was nature. You came to the city, you lived in a concrete jungle, to mix my metaphors. Um, but I think that in that it is a key to sort of understanding what the city could be and should become, which is to understand that nature is not it's not the opposite of living in the city, but rather it's sorry, that is my phone. Somewhere else. But it's not living exclusive to how we live in the city, but it is in fact just this thinking of the city itself as a different kind of landscape. It has its own parts of it, and just to reiterate the conception of nature. Historically, we back in the sort of 18th, 17th century, the conception of nature was that it was the unknown. It was the age of
Rousseau.
exploration, and it was somehow uh, unknowable, and that was an acceptance of that. Somehow, along the way that we began to congregate in cities, uh, I think the philosophy, rational philosophy at least, developed that we could tame nature, that this was something that, and of course we've relied on that for our whole economy, our whole
Well, and
supply chain.
we've destroyed, by taming, we mean destroy and extract for our own benefit. Um, but I'm curious because there is, and I want to come back to some of how we're combating what we've historically done to move into the future. But I mean, I want to touch on something else, that the role of the architecture in the city beyond nature and well-being, which is of course like shaping the cultural identity of that urban center. You led, I believe, United Architects, who was one of the finalists in the World Trade Center competition. That, I mean, obviously, I was in New York during 9/11. What has happened, at Ground Zero is phenomenal. One World Trade is extraordinary. I couldn't love the memorial more to, 9/11 victims. Um, you were intimately involved in that. Like, what role do you believe that architects should be playing in either preserving, conserving, or transforming that cultural identity of a particular place?
Well, so that's a very um, difficult question, and difficult. I don't mean that it's so problematic that we shouldn't be discussing it. I mean, it is in essence the you hit the nail on the head. It's exactly the questions we should be asking. I'm not sure I have answers, but I do think that it's helpful that we start to frame our view a little bit differently than we have been, and that is to understand, again, coming back to this idea of wilderness in particular, that unknowable part of nature, that the city has its own wilderness and its own um, like areas of terra incognito,
Mhm.
This has its own areas that somehow have yet to be discovered, and it's just a question of how we start to go about it. And that was exactly what happened with Ground Zero. I mean, after Ground Zero was, in essence, an act of sheer destruction, but what it left was its own terra incognita. And part of that experience was, how do you interpret something that itself was at the time completely under unknowable, and how do you give that some kind of a shape and direction without necessarily saying this is what it had to be. So that was the spirit that I think I gathered basically all my friends. And we came up with our proposal.
And I mean, if we go back to Beijing or just China, where IF Design, who presents Future of XYZ, and where I work, has a huge footprint, especially in the design and architecture space. I think about Shanghai,
Yeah.
which, so much of the urban development has come at the expense of historic preservation. I mean, is there, in addition to the responsibility that architects have for shaping the cultural identity of a city, is there also not a responsibility in that to balance historical preservation with modern innovation?
Oh, absolutely. I think that that's another sort of one of those tropes that dominated at least the early part of my career, was that uh, you know building new was good, and I saw this a lot in Asia, where it was oh, we don't want things that were um, ancient or old. We want something new. We want to be, if you're a developing country, I understand that cultural impetus, but so much is lost, and I think we've now at a point where that fortunately we've embraced um, m- the just the fabric of what makes those cities interesting, all cities interesting. It's not just building new, and obviously, of course, there are environmental reasons why that can be called into question, and that helps support, I think, the argument. But more importantly, as you were saying, the cultural part of it is, why give up part of your history? It helps ground, where you are, and
And it
that
makes every city unique, which his
right.
increasingly they're becoming more and more, I mean, for lack of a better word, monotonous.
Yes. I-
It's interesting. You're coming to something that I know you're an expert in and your firm specializes in, which is adaptive reuse.
yeah.
I guess we probably need to, in your answer, describe briefly what adaptive reuse is for people who aren't urban planners or architects. But what role do you think that adaptive reuse plays in the future of urban development? And subsequently, I'd also love you to talk a little bit about like repurposing for solving like a lot of the housing crisis. If we in fact are going to continue to increase our populations in cities, New York is a great example where, you have a lot of empty commercial buildings right now, right? And we need a lot more residential and affordable residential. Like, does adaptive reuse have any benefit there, or is it how is it used, and can it be used to solve some of our economic challenges as well?
Well, yes, I think this is again where I come back to terms like regenerative. I think that's easier for people to comprehend, because what we're talking about, essentially growing new shoots of life in in let's say, fields that were have already been plowed, and you have sometimes you have to let that percolate, and the word culture itself comes from cultivating. So it just to keep going back to those sort of natural roots of our language. Um, so the regenerative reuse of existing buildings is really where you take a building that's there that was originally purposed to, say, be a factory, say downtown New York. Most of Tribeca, for example, was all factories, most of them electrical. And or where I live in the West Village, all printing factories. And and then an understanding that within that are possibilities of people living in these spaces, and how do you transform them? And New York now has a well-established history, and think a lot of it has to do with the preservation movement that came out of the worst types of urban renewal,
Yep.
yep, left over from Robert Moses and his
Which of
generation.
course have an enormous amount to do with racism and dysfunction and economic class system in cities around the world.
Yeah, so I think the idea that you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that there are ways to position existing buildings, especially in what we call now today in New York Class B office buildings, where they were built. A lot of them were built in the 70s, um, and they have enclosed curtain walls, some of them glass or a combination of glass and precast or whatever material, but they were completely uh, enclosed, isolated. And then the possibility is that some of them, not all of them, can become places where people can live. Um, and I think even more than that, the whole uh, thinking, at least is that at least the most enlightened thinking, as far as I'm concerned, is in creating neighborhoods, and some of those neighborhoods can actually be inside of a single building where you have multiple uses. In that, some of them can be office, some of them living, and that some of them, uh, cultural spaces, galleries, and things like that. So the more um, mixture of life that you can bring to the existing fabric, I think that bodes well for the regeneration of the city.
Um, I think there's kind of this, and we're coming really close up on time, so I'm gonna have ask you to answer a couple of these like a little more rapid fire. But like you've worked on really, really huge commercial buildings, like the 1.5 million square foot Barclays North American headquarters, or a bunch of the retail spaces for Bloomingdale's, which are hundreds of thousands of square feet. You've worked on cultural institutions like the Rodin Museum in South Korea, but you've also done increasingly a bunch of zero carbon luxury eco resorts in wilderness areas. I'm curious, across all these projects, like there is a very big challenge in my experience in architecture of not only merging design excellence with ecological responsibility, but also selling that in. And when we're thinking about adaptive reuse or culture or bringing nature in, all these things that obviously you have passion for, Kevin.
Yeah.
How is that balance happening? And do we see a trend moving in the correct direction as far as urbanization goes?
Well, we do live in the U.S., and the U.S. is dominated primarily by economic necessity, and so it's not always sometimes it's a very, very difficult thing to do. Um, Fortunately, I do feel that more and more people are at least who live in New York City, become a little bit more enlightened about this. But I was talking recently to a developer in Miami, and I was saying, "Where are you guys putting in um, sustainable initiatives?" And he was like, Nobody's buying it. We live in Florida. This is," and I'm like, wow, this is you live in a place that is subject to all kinds of um,
Climate related
climate
disasters?
related, potential disasters. And oh yeah, the resiliency, that's something we can build into it, and that's an infrastructure problem. It's not a building by building problem. And so that, part of why it's important to provide uh, visionary leadership is to change. And it's, to some degree, it's political, to begin to change people's perceptions so that they'll demand to things, and yeah.
I mean, I am a little curious how in Miami, a developer can't see that climate change is coming for them and that they'd want to, but again, that's America where we say, okay, they're going to claim an insurance claim and everyone will do, and they'll just tear it down and waste it. Whereas if we're talking about the Netherlands, they're building entire infrastructures that are built for, managing waters, and in France or in South America. I mean, basically everyone's doing it differently than we are.
Well, that's and again, you sort of, and the Netherlands, they've been doing that for centuries.
Yeah.
That's part of their historic culture. The U.S., we haven't been doing that, and because we don't. Again, the U.S. has been sort of dominated by a frontier thinking of, oh, we have to build new. We have to leave the past behind.
What does
Um,
that mean for kind of the future generation of architects as we look ahead? I mean, you lecture at places like Yale and Columbia. I mean, Yale is both are one of the top architectural schools in the country. Hopefully, will still remain, despite the current political crisis. But kind of what are the lessons that future architects are being taught, and what do you think is the most important thing if we're thinking about the future of urbanization?
Well, I think we have to start to understand that there's more to architecture than just solving problems. I mean, um, and and we're going to have to author the future. We're going to have to provide, um, and I do think that I am a complete proponent of expanding what it means to be an architect. I think we've really narrowed it into something that is, it's become a kind of not even a very valuable commodity. And I think that means getting engaged, getting engaged politically, getting engaged um, in any kind, lots of endeavors that involve your community, and understanding that architecture, despite the fact of how it's being portrayed in movies like The Brutalist and with this kind of solo Howard Rourke kind
Howard
of,
Rourke.
yeah, type of endeavor, that it's fundamentally social. And a lot of people get into architecture when they realize, oh, this is great. I can hang out in the studio, be with my friends. We can kind of have fun, or at least suffer, collectively. So yeah, that would be my biggest takeaway.
And do you think, I mean, and then I'm going to dive into our last question. I mean, I have, as you probably picked up on, I have a lot of experience in this industry. It's one of my favorite of the design disciplines, and that's hard to say. But worldwide, architecture is a super sexy, revered profession, right? It's the very Howard Rourke, Ayn Rand Fountainhead, for people who don't know that, dominated by these super cool projects and these architects and, all of this. And yet the majority of you barely make enough to survive. You are burdened with immense amounts of schooling. And I know this from multiple countries around the world. And then in the US and everywhere else, you have these continuing education credits that almost no one else other than nurses perhaps has anything akin to. Is there going to be enough? And then you have developers who think that they're architects, right? So are there going to be enough architects and urban planners to help us carry forward the future of urbanization in the way that the population of this world is going to demand?
Well, again, this is going to sound contrarian, and I have great hope in AI. I'm not sure if that means we're going to have more. I think we're just going to be able to do more if we harness AI properly. Architecture has become overly specialized, and that was a recipe for a lot of architects to become moderately successful. At least making a decent wage. But I do think that the skill set that's demanded of AI is really much more a generalist skill set, and hopefully, that will become something that will be attractive to a number of people, especially those with maybe more of a liberal arts education, and who have a broader view of the world.
Interesting. So second to last question, Kevin, what is, if you were pointing our listeners and viewers in one direction for an iconic reference or resource on urbanization, what would it be?
Um, there's my friend Vishan Chakrabarty just wrote a great book, um, and and unfortunately the title escapes me. It's something about urbanism, but it's a fantastic book, and it's really very well written. It's got some great, um, and it's I think it's about less than a year old.
Chakravarti is the journalist.
He's actually an architect.
Is he?
Yeah, and he's an interesting guy. He started out at SOM, and he was the number two under Amanda Burden when she was um
SOM being a very famous New
yeah,
York-based architectural firm.
yeah. And so anyway,
It's Skidmore, Owings, Merrill, I think is that what it is?
Skidmore, Owings, that's SOM. Sorry, so yeah, I think it's maybe the architecture and urbanism, something like that.
Cool.
But sorry, Vashon, if you're listening, but Chakrabarty and get his book. It's
very cool. And to close, Kevin, I mean, you've touched on a lot of this, but like if you think, far out, like 25 years out to 2050, when we think that, 7 out of 10 people on this planet are going to be living in urban centers, what's your greatest hope for the future of urbanization?
My greatest hope is that it's inclusive and diverse, and we accept the diversity of that, and we understand, embrace it as what makes cities special and unique, and that we start to understand that our city is just another landscape, and it's another kind of nature. And once we start to think of that and think of it less in terms of a polarity, but actually a part of the wilderness that needs to be tamed in its own way by its own set of rules, and that we sort of open our eyes to those possibilities. And let's not try and rewrite the world, but let's try to understand it first.
Well, that's a very nice place to end. Kevin Kennon, thank you so much for joining us today on Future of XYZ.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much for having me. It's a gas.
And everyone watching and listening, thanks for joining us. You know where to find us if you're listening on whatever podcast platform you love. You can find us also on YouTube if you prefer to watch, but make sure you follow us on social media and leave a 5-star review. That's how people find us. I'm trying to ask more. It's not my strength, so do it, please, if you like this show. And we will see you again in 2 weeks' time. Kevin, thanks again.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, bye-bye.